Hello, welcome to Chapter 8 of Geography for Gilgit Community College. Today we'll be discussing the geographic profile of Oceania. To introduce the region, someone has their mic on, please, if you could mute that. I'll mute it then. To discuss the region of Oceania, we can start with what is Oceania, right? We're going to define Oceania as essentially the Pacific world. We're covering about a third of the Earth's surface with this discussion of Oceania, and it is, well, the Pacific world, right? It's the Pacific. Specifically, we're going to talk about Australia, New Zealand, and the islands of the mid-Pacific, all those random islands all over there. We're going to discuss Antarctica a bit in this chapter, mostly because it doesn't fit anyplace else, and it's not worth its own chapter. So, basic data table here for Oceania. A lot of the countries we're going to talk about are very, very small. Oceania, population-wise, is far and away dominated by Australia, the largest of them. Most of these countries have less than 1 million people. Most of these countries are less than 1,000 square miles. And most of these countries, to be honest, are rather poor, right? A lot of these don't have a per capita GNI PPP associated with them because some of these aren't even their own countries. Notice a lot of these, such as Guam, Cook Islands, North Mariana Islands, these are actually territories that are still owned by other countries. So that we do have some within themselves countries here, but even at that point, they're still very small. So we're going to talk about, in this region, we're going to discuss some major Pacific Island regions, such as the Black Islands, the Tiny Islands, and the Many Islands, or Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. The typical traits of the islands we're going to talk about are, again, very, very small. Small in population, small in size, archipelago-style islands, usually rather poor and ex-colonies, and since they are very small islands, heavily dependent on foreign aid. Again, with the exception of Australia and arguably New Zealand for all of these. Picture of what we're talking about here. Again, we're basically talking about all this stuff in the Pacific Ocean. We talked about Indonesia, the Philippines, those islands, a bit with Southeast Asia, because they are more, they are geographically maybe better set in with this Oceania template. And I'm sure if you ask Indonesian, they probably would tell you they would favor Oceania over, let's say, Asian. That being said, the book has to find some way to subdivide these things. And Australia, in and of itself, is such a big player in this conversation that if you clump Australia in with Asia, which you could arguably do, right, geographically speaking, how are you going to talk about all these other little tiny islands? So you can kind of see if you're writing a book here, how exactly you're going to fill this stuff together. You can kind of see why they subdivide the way they subdivide. At least I would make that argument. Oceania is, again, the Pacific Ocean, so very large in terms of spatial distance, but the islands themselves are very tiny. These are actually little circles, are not indicative of the shape of the island because the islands are so small. That being said, notice the size of Australia, very large, right, in comparison to the United States. Perhaps you didn't realize that, but Australia is a very large continent. The people of Oceania, our regional population, again, this is 2014, 2013 numbers, so these numbers have all gone up. Regional population of below 50 million or 37 million. The vast majority of that is Australia. Population growth rates vary widely. The more developed, more populous countries such as Australia and New Zealand have slower growth rates that we associate again with like Europe. And the smaller, more rural countries such as Papua New Guinea down here, notoriously poor country, has a very high population rate. Again, these things we associate together. Significant overpopulation and significant immigration issues here. And there is a sort of, you live on this little tiny island that you could sort of argue is a what's the word I'm looking for here? Paradise, right? What are you going to do with the rest of the world's building and factories and industrialization? How's that going to cope with a little tiny paradise island? A question that these people are dealing with. Population density, right? Tiny islands, very small amount of people. I keep being this trend. Those few hits of population density are cities. That's it. There is not really, and then the surrounding suburbs. There isn't a there's not a large amount of people in this particular part of the world. Cartogram, as we've seen before, again, this is even all the islands, right? Because some of these islands are so tiny, you can't even have that conversation. Nations' dependencies of population under 100K are not shown on the map. Urbanization areas, size of the cities, these cities are tiny, and all but one is Australian, right? We looked at, when we were talking about Asia before, so many of those cities had over 10 million people in them. The combination of all these cities doesn't reach the size of, let's say, Paris or Tokyo or someplace very popular like that. The entire populations in these areas are hitting a few large cities in other parts of the world. This should be a slide, not a blank thing. I guess I'll just say physical geography. We're talking mainly all islands here. Australia itself is an actual plate. So let me go back to this picture. Australia itself is an actual plate. It's an actual continent in and of itself, similar to North America, Europe, what have you. The rest of these are very much, all those little tiny islands, a lot of those are what we call hotspot islands, which we talked about in chapter 2. And then New Guinea, New Zealand, Indonesia, that is essentially mountain building islands. Those are tectonically active islands. And the entire region between China and Australia once was actually a land bridge that the waters receded from. So the Indonesia, New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, Vanuatu area is essentially highlands from Pangaea way back in the day. And again, all those islands are either tectonically active zones or hotspot islands, because the Ring of Fire essentially runs right through all this stuff. The Pacific Ring of Fire that I'm sure you've heard about goes right through the Carolina Islands and all these Fiji and stuff like that down. So physical geography, I need to work in the slide apparently. I've forgotten about this. Climates and biome, not a whole lot to talk about in this particular conversation. When you picture these islands, what are you picturing? Tropical regions, right? Australia is a notable exception here. The majority of this chapter is about Australia, to be honest. Australia is majority desert. And again, that's probably, when you picture Australia, you probably picture a desert-like climate, right? You're either picturing Crocodile Dundee, Steve Irwin jungle, or you're picturing Uluru and Aboriginal people and vast swaths of desert. A funny part down there, you have a little spot on the underside of Australia that's considered a Mediterranean climate. Very far away from the Mediterranean, right? But still, it has that nice, not too hot, not too cold temperature, just the right amount of rain, things along those natures, the olive growing, wine growing sort of temperatures. And, well, that's because you're on the edge of a steppe or desert climate, so you're not going to have those same heat as you're getting closer to the water. And why, for example, is the desert touching the water on the west, but let's say dies out as it approaches the eastern side of Australia? That has to do with your winds and your ocean currents and stuff like that, and where it's taking the heat and where it's moving the cold. Biome, of course, meshes up almost perfectly with the climate, as it always does. Where you have your tropical climate, you have your tropical biome. Where you have your desert climate, you have your desert biome. Cool. So I think we do cover, I believe there's a land use eventually, but if we don't run into a land use map in this particular setting, you still understand what's going on in this conversation, right? Kind of land use you're going to have in a desert? Desert style nomadic land use. What kind of land use you're going to have with a temperate mixed forest? Probably some sustenance agriculture, right? So the book likes to break down the islands, this particular part of the world, into three distinct styles. And I talked a bit about this before. Continental islands, which are continents, and they're attached to continents before sea level changes, such as Australia and New Zealand, what have you. High islands, the result of volcanic activity, as I said before, your hotspot islands like Hawaii and the Samoas, or low islands, which are the irregular lagoon coral reef islands, the really, really tiny ones, because the land isn't iron-rich igneous rocks that produced it. It's calcite and things of that nature from coral reefs, such as Carolina and the Marshall Islands. These are tiny little islands. High islands, such as Tahiti here, right? Your island paradise. When you picture island paradise, you picture those things. We got a question down here. Why does it show tropical rainforests on the northeast part of Australia in the biodiversity map? This corner up here in the northeast, and it shows tropical rainforests. I would assume that's because, right, as I said before, with your wind and your water currents, you're going to be moving heat, you're moving cold around in certain ways, such that you're going to catch that moisture in that hot tropical environment in that particular part of the world. You're getting awfully close to the equator up there, and the Pacific Ring there it's all surrounding that corner with tropical rainforest, so you're going to see that. Yeah, I would say that's mostly due to ocean currents carrying the heat around in certain ways, as opposed to southeast, as it says there was Mediterranean scrub. Difference between a tropical rainforest and a Mediterranean environment would be mostly precipitation and slightly less temperature. So that would be my answer to that question. So low island, right? This is the thing. A high island is your tropical paradise. The low island is the one you get stuck on when your plane crashes and you ride a board there, right? It's yeah. The what was that Tom Hanks movie? Castaway, I believe. Low island would be Castaway. High island would be the one that you pay thousands of dollars to go to. There's land use. And I said land use, it's basically what I said, right? Cultivation and grazing your desert areas, your specialized horticulture, some of your sustenance farming, some plantation, quote unquote, farming going around. But as I said at the start of this conversation, you don't have a lot of natural resources in this part of the world, excluding Australia, more or less. So you don't have a lot of growing. The growing you can, right? What are you going to grow on an island this big where the entire island is taken? You could swim to where this guy is taking this picture. That's how small this island is, right? You can grow something here. You can't grow something there. So that's how the land use in this particular part of the world works. And shifting cultivation, as I said up there in Papua New Guinea, at the top there, shifting cultivation essentially means you don't have good farming. Geologic hotspots, as I talked about before, Hawaii would be an example of this. These essentially are undersea volcanoes that erupt, and the plate moves over top of the erupting volcano such that you can kind of trace the movement of the plate based on how the direction of the islands. This takes a bit more geology than I'm going to get into at the moment, but suffice it to say, the big island of Hawaii is more or less directly underneath a active volcano. And you go to Hawaii, you can go see those volcanoes erupting, right? And the smaller islands of Hawaii used to have those active volcanoes there, but they don't anymore, or they're not as active as they were. So again, this is more of a geology thing. I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's kind of cool that you can look at Hawaii and say, oh, that's how the Pacific plate has been moving over the past 2.5 million years, let's say. Atolls, right? This is a bit more of geology related things, but you have some sort of island building event happen. Over time, erosion and weathering destroys the island, and what's left is whatever stands to remain. In this case, a barrier reef forming an atoll. As I said a lot of times, we're going to go over this a lot in this chapter, not a lot of actual produce and industry in these particular part of the world, so you make use with what you can. People still have to weave coconut leaves together to form whatever they need to form to get by on the day. Right? This guy's actually weaving the leaves, looks like using the husk of the coconut to create something. Truth be told, in this particular part of the world, there's probably not a lot of other options for jobs and employment. Vulnerability of the ocean's ecosystems, Oceania's ecosystems. This is a big driving factor of this chapter. You have a lot of endemic species in this part of the world. Endemic species essentially means that they're only found there. Think of the Galapagos turtles or something like that. Galapagos turtles are found in the Galapagos. If those die out, we have no more of that species of turtle. Since you have a lot of islands, of isolated locations, you run into a situation where humans go to this island because they find it a beautiful place to vacation. Well, that island probably has a lot of species on it. And the people that build luxury resorts for millionaires probably don't care very much about that unique type of bug or butterfly that only exists in that island. Those things happen very often. And beyond humans being terrible, of course, you have volcanic eruptions, typhoons, sea level changes, things along that line that can wreak havoc and cause destruction. Hawaii, you could think of as sort of an extinction capital of the world. There was at one point a lot of endemic native species to Hawaii that, over the course of colonization and statehood in Hawaii, they built giant cities, built giant harbors to take in tourists, what have you. A lot of the plant and animal life on Hawaii simply doesn't exist anymore because it was killed out by human-induced extinction events. And logging would be another issue shown down here with the commercial logging on the island of New Guinea. Lots of different plant species there, lots of those native to New Guinea. But those trees don't make a lot of people money standing there looking pretty. We chop them down, sell them, we can make some money, right? These forests look diverse and wonderful and beautiful, but New Guinea is also a very poor nation. So how do you balance these two things? You're not going to have the people of New Guinea starving to death because this picture looks pretty, are you? No. You have to find a way to deal with this issue. Cultural and historical geographies. Australia and New Zealand, I'm sure you won't be very surprised to find, are mainly European in culture and ethnicity. Of course, Australia was a prison colony for the British. It does exist. I know there's crazy conspiracy memes on Facebook and stuff about Australia being fake. It's real. You can take my word for that. New Zealand was, along those same lines, a very European-centric nation. Other parts of the world, such as Fiji, Guam, what have you, were at one time fully indigenous, but again, Guam is a U.S. territory. Fiji is that place you think of when you think of rich people going to vacation and take their Instagram photos. You have an influx of foreign travel there, and we'll get into that half indigenous, half foreign, and what that means in terms of the economy when we get there. And the majority of Oceania's population, besides these 4 or 5 examples, is still predominantly indigenous. The people living on the island have lived there for a long time, but that's slowly changing and evolving as those indigenous people know you can only make so much money where they're living and want to make more elsewhere. The tale of Oceania is a very complicated, very unknown settlement process. Settlements thought to begin in this region about 50,000 years ago. arguably across the land bridge that connects New Guinea to Australia. That's the thought, at least, again, during the times of Pangea and the glaciation, as I talked about before. The Aborigines were, of course, the native people of Australia. And then how do they get up to all those different islands? That's somewhat unknown. Most people think they boated in some way, but when and how and who did that is unknown. If you've seen the movie Moana, that's actually a theory as to how these different various islands in the middle of nowhere got inhabited. Well, Moana isn't theory, but Moana does a not bad way of relaying the information. The language of this particular part of the world is, of course, very complex, as every other part of the world is, with, of course, the native languages, Aboriginal, Papuan, and things of that nature. English and French, of course, are very popular in this part of the world because of the history of colonization, as we talked about, and go more detail into. But yeah, it's a part of the world. There's lots of languages. It's how that game is played, right? This map is a interesting and fun deviation from a usual language map in that it shows you the transference of the languages over the course of history, where the languages came from and how they migrated and traveled around. Again, this stuff is hard to really set in stone because the cultures that traveled and moved and migrated throughout in the Bronze Age, in the BC time, BCE, before the Common Era, didn't write a lot of stuff down. If they did write it down, we don't have it very preserved very well. So there's a lot of inference and speculation about how, for example, people got to live on the Solomon Islands, right? Of course, this is geography. We need to talk about how the Europeans came in and colonized everything. Europeans were the first voyagers to this region, and that's a very terrible way of saying it. They weren't, by any stretch of the imagination, the first voyagers, but that's the way they phrase it. Europeans, of course, when the Europeans go someplace, what do? They establish trade routes. They bring in their missionaries. They settle where they want. They do to the locals what they want, and then they take all the money they can. You know this conversation very well. When we go to Africa, they will talk about them doing that in Africa, South America, North America, of course, with the native populations here. Same song and dance. And the religion is, of course, a very good representation of how that effect happened. All these different nations, all these different people had their own variations on religion. They all believed what they natively believed for, as you can see by these numbers, literally a couple thousand years. But look at it nowadays, where the majority of the religions, Roman Catholic, a couple Anglicans here and there. As you get closer to Indonesia, you get more Muslim and Hindu. But since the Europeans were the ones that colonized and took these nations, their missionaries left the religions of whatever country took it over. That's why you have so much Catholic. The economy of the region, as said before, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand, is poor. Tourist economies. What are you going to do when your island is a couple hundred square miles and that's split up over 15 different islands, and you have 500,000 people? You have a small city as your entire nation. You can't really do a whole lot, right? So how do you make a living in this part of the world? Again, excluding Australia and New Zealand, arguably. Plantation crops. It says plantation because plantation means the people working there don't own it, right? Fish and minerals, to some extent. That fourth one's interesting. Services for Western military interests. As we said at the very beginning, a lot of the islands in this part of the world are not in of themselves nations. The people that live there are not the people that own the island. Various other countries do, Guam being, of course, a big example, and they build military bases so that Americans can have planes and boats and soldiers near Asia and don't have to cross the Pacific if they don't need to. Information, IT, textile, sure. And tourism, of course, will be the other big one, wherein when you picture these island paradises, you're picturing a couple of rich people sitting on a beach drinking out of a coconut, right? Uh, Here is a island. I'm not going to Nauru. I don't know. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But they found some natural resources on this, and this is, of course, a lot of this part of the world is not very often cared about. So you go here. Oh, hey, we found phosphate. Let's burn the island essentially to a crisp to grab all that phosphate. I guarantee you, this island did not look this way 1,000 years ago. But phosphate's expensive. Said Oceania was entirely once colonial. France technically still holds some colonies there. And you could argue America does too, but we don't use the word colony anymore because we can just do that. As said before, the military interests in this part of the world are very powerful, especially because you're right next to Asia, and Asia has got a lot of people, a lot of countries that the rest of the world wants to watch over. China, India in particular, and Japan to some extent. World War II, that a big issue was getting all those boats from America to Japan, right? So you have a lot of military and economic issues going on. Plus, you're in a very isolated part of the world, so you get issues like atomic testing and things along those lines. Environmental failures. Talked about this before, gonna beat this down again. You have island nations that are very, very small that people have been living on for literally thousands of years. And if the sea levels rise, us around the Greek campuses don't care because we're thousands of miles from the ocean, right? You have, well, maybe 1,000 miles. You have people that the island itself is maybe a few feet above the sea level at its tallest point. Oceans rise a few inches, you are talking massive amounts of their land being taken up by water. Atolls disappearing, that plants and animals living on these particular parts of the world not existing anymore. Plus, oceans move and ebb and flow and tidal surges, what have you. You can have islands be completely washed out by changes in the ocean. You would think you would care. You don't want all these peoples, all these islands to die because global warming. But again, you're talking about subtract Australia from the conversation, maybe 10 million people living in all these different islands. That's not a lot of sway, especially since, right? What are the main money makers here? Tourism, mineral exploitation, plantation, military interests. They don't have a lot of clout money-wise to get what they want accomplished. So let's go to the big two islands real quick. Australia and New Zealand. Similar population, cultural heritage, political issues, orientation, economy, what have you. They are both British colonies, have a strong British heritage. Technically prosperous countries, especially in relation to the rest of Oceania. That's really not much of a competition. But they are, Australia in particular is definitely a very capitalist-centric country. So when other countries are populous, prosperous, the entire country isn't doing super well. Like in, for example, Dubai, you instead have your few have a lot of the money and the rest without, right? I think the richest person in Australia owns a mining company, right? I think she's worth some 30 or 40 billion dollars. And there's actually in the as of the recording of this video, there is a big issue wherein a Australian mining company is digging up and destroying ancient Aboriginal sites to go mine up minerals. And the Aboriginal people are like, hey, these sites have been sacred to us for thousands and thousands of years. Don't do this. And the Australian mining company is like, well, I'm worth $40 billion. I can't hear you over my money. That stuff is still going on literally today. Australia and New Zealand gained their independence at the turn of the century. and they've kind of been close to us, right? If you picture Australia, you're not picturing something necessarily abstract, or you can picture an Australian very easily, right? They're in pop culture, um, things along those lines. Heck, I think the Australian flag still has a Union Jack on it, right? Pictures of the areas, noteworthy cities. Yeah, you've heard a lot of these things. You've heard of Sydney Opera House, right? Sadly, you've probably heard of Christchurch for not good reasons. Queenstown, maybe. Auckland, Melbourne. Yeah, I don't think I need to go too deep into Australia. However, the Aborigines is something that is an important concept to know about. The Aborigines are the indigenous inhabitants of the country of Australia, i.e., before the British sent their prisoners there. There was an estimated up to 1 million Aboriginal people living in Australia before the arrival of the British. That's estimated, of course. They didn't keep records themselves. But when the British arrived, they sent the prisoners and they sent the soldiers to watch the prisoners. Naturally, they slaughtered and drove the Aboriginal people away from the good farmland, right? So nowadays you have maybe 500,000 Aboriginals left, and they live in the tropical north of the country, where at one point they lived in the majority of the population. The Aboriginal people suffer a lot of the same issues that our Native American populations suffer with in America: high infant mortality rate, high unemployment, low life expectancy, arguments with land rights and things along those lines. David asks, is there any prominent military that resides in Oceania, or is it just bases for the global powers? Australia has a military, and that would be the only noteworthy one. If you cut over to the islands in the south of Asia, such as Indonesia, you're gonna hit. I think Indonesia's got a military too, not on a scale of like United States military, of course, but no, the islands. These outside of these two, there's nothing worth talking about. Exotic species. This is funny. Well, it's not funny. It's sad, but it's still kind of weird to think about. When the Europeans came to this part of the world, they of course brought animals that they like to eat. Animals including rabbits, foxes, water buffalo, cane toads, sheep, cattle, what have you. When you bring a animal to a place that it did not exist before, it tends to take over because there's no natural predation. A classic example being rabbits being introduced to Australia. Rabbits didn't have any natural predators, and if you know rabbits, they're kind of famous for something, right? So rabbits basically took over and started destroying the ecology of Australia. So much so that ranchers were paid lots of money to go out there and shoot all the rabbits to try to control the population. They introduced, I think, like new variations of snakes and birds to this part of the world to try to handle the growth. I mean, look at all those rabbits in that picture. That's nuts, right? And this is not exclusive to Australia. Other parts of the world have the same issue from the you don't think about the side effects of colonization this way, but they very much are. So, talk about Antarctica real quick. Technically the world's 5th largest continent. You want to count it that way. It's also the windiest and the driest. Gigantic desert, as I've said before. You don't live on Antarctica. You stay there as a scientist because it's a giant ice sheet, right? If you ever heard of the ozone hole, that was concentrated over Antarctica, and it was growing up until the 80s. We got rid of CFCs and things along those lines. It started to shrink. That's good. I don't like dying. And there's an Antarctic treaty signed in 1961 that essentially lessens the ease for you to go to Antarctica, because we don't want people just going there and dying. There's literally nothing in Antarctica. So that's one of the reasons why it was signed. And then also to make sure all countries play fair on there. You can't mine Antarctica. You can't drill for oil in Antarctica. You can't hunt in Antarctica, things along those lines. It's pure science for the next 50 or so years. Well, sorry, 30 or so years. I'm sure I don't need to show you a picture of Antarctica. You can picture it yourself very well. And that's Oceania. I'll stop recording here, and then if you have any questions, you can ask me. Pretty short, pretty sweet, right? And Oceania is not super complex. It's all kind of sad. That's the majority of this book is. So, thanks for watching.